For people unfamiliar with you, if you would just please tell us your name, a little bit about your background, and really what you've been doing for the last 20 years.
20, gosh.
For the last several years.
Um, my name's Caitlin Shetterly. I wrote a book called Modified that came out 2 years ago that's about the GMO debate. To write that book, I drove across the Great Plains by myself, and then I went to Europe and I traveled with beekeepers and wrote about honey and bees. And I wrote about Oaxaca and GMO corn contamination in the seat of corn agriculture in Mexico. And it was a great adventure, and I learned a lot. And my book is a journey book, and it's a book about being a mother, and it's a book about being a woman in the male fields of agriculture and science and medicine. And it's also a book about what we're doing to the planet in the ways that we grow our food.
Let's speak about your book, Modified, GMOs and the Threat to Our Food, Our Land, Our Future. The book began as a personal odyssey through illness. Can you talk a bit about that and how the whole journey started for you?
Well, in the late 2000s, I had an illness that no one could diagnose. And I still don't know exactly what caused it. I went to a doctor who thought it was caused by the pesticides that are bred into and used on some combination of the two, or the synergistic effect of the two, GMO corn and soy, and suggested I take those out of my diet. I did so and I got better, but a lot of things were changed in my diet at that time. I began to become much more aware of organic, and even though I thought I knew a lot about organic, it turned out there was a lot for me still to learn, and I started buying much more locally and making more food from scratch, and I got better. So that was where the book began, and the story of the book was really just trying to figure out if there was any relevance to what this doctor had suggested, and if so, what was the larger story there for all of us to learn about.
You write in the first chapter that you had no idea what a GMO even was, and that you initially just wanted to figure that part out, but the answer wasn't so easy to understand, so you started digging, and you've just alluded to that in your last answer. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, like most people, I didn't actually know what a genetically modified organism was, or what went into it, or the fact that a pesticide was bred into the plant, so that if a pest took a bite, it would have a pesticidal action on the plant. On the pest. So I didn't know that, and I didn't understand how it worked. And but I described sort of peering into a dark closet or cupboard and closing the door and thinking, this is not for me, this big ag stuff, and this is for Michael Pollan and his many assistants or something. But my interest was piqued as a mother, as a writer, as a truth seeker. And so I kept slowly over the years interviewing people and doing research and trying to learn more about the GMO itself, and whether I cared about the GMO or I cared more about the pesticides that they go with. And my book, Modified, is sort of the ultimate end result of those years.
Eventually, you published a piece in Elle magazine called The Bad Seed about GMO corn. The piece went viral. Because of it, you were attacked quite hard by Big Ag. Can you talk about what that was like for you?
It was a very strange experience. I don't consider myself an activist. I'm a writer. I'm a storyteller. I was interested in this from a story standpoint. So when that happened, I more than anything was just sort of shocked by it. It was a very odd week in my life when this was all coming down. I had editors calling me to ask if I wanted to write a book. And at the same time, I had some of these Big Ag henchmen posing as journalists threatening to ruin my career. So it was a very bipolar time in my life. And eventually I ended up signing on with an editor to write a book, but I knew that I had touched a nerve with that piece. The question was why. And I realized I needed to do more research.
We've heard you say that the book took 5 years from the early beginnings to publication. All that time, you had already published a book of short stories on the subject of divorce called Fault Lines, and a memoir about the recession called Made for You and Me. Did you know this would be your next book, and when did you figure that out?
Well, no, in fact, I was resistant to the idea of doing this as a book, but when the piece came out in Elle and editors started contacting me, at first, I said no to lots of people. I turned a lot of people down. I didn't really want to be the person who wrote that book. And in some ways, I still don't want to be. But eventually, I got an editor who I liked, who was willing to just do a journey book with me through the topic, who agreed that I may not have any real answers by the end of it, but that I would just find out what I could. And it seemed like it would be a fun adventure. And so I took it on for that reason.
The writing of the book is so easy and accessible. It has drawings throughout it that you did of things like honey bears and gene guns and certain pests to crops, and one drawing by your then 6-year-old son. Tell me about how you decided to write in such a conversational, easy voice.
I just write how I talk. I've always been that way. I've been writing since I was 12. I mean, I had my first piece published when I was 12, and my mother's a writer, and I've just always written in a really naturalistic way. And I think I as I said, I had sort of the target. My target person was a mom at the beach with her kids, not kids who are so young that they could drown, but who are running in and out of the water, and she's putting sunscreen on them and giving them water and snacks. And I wanted her to be able to put my book down and pick it back up mid-sentence, and it would be as easy as a Tom Clancy novel or something, that it would be completely facile and that she would not need a PhD in the meantime. So, that took time to digest everything, to get it to that point and throw things away that I didn't think needed to be said. But I'm not a pretentious person. I don't feel like I need to wow anybody with my smarts. If anything, I feel like it's more important to downplay and to make things accessible, which takes a different kind of intelligence, actually, to make things easy to read. Some people actually like that. I mean, some people really like hard to understand writers, and it makes them think they're really smart, and they are really smart often. But those writers often lose me because I feel so aware of their intelligence that I can't necessarily succumb to the story.
In the book, you go 3 places, to the Great Plains and Heartland, which you drive across, interviewing farmers and scientists and activists, to Europe, where you hang out with beekeepers and government officials, and then to California, where you interview 2 scientists who were threatened by Big Ag. The thing that struck us the most was that you were a woman in an almost entirely male field, pretty much everywhere. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, until you've experienced that, you aren't necessarily aware of it. And I can't say, I was aware of it in some ways as it was happening, but it was actually when a friend of mine, my friend Susan, read the book, and she said, you realize this is constant men. You need some women in this book. Are there any women? And so I did kind of go back at that draft and try to bring in some more female voices. But yeah, it's agriculture and science are still predominantly male fields. So I try to write the book from that perspective.
Of those, which trip was the most fun for you to take and why?
They were all fun in different ways. I love this country, so driving across the Great Plains was something I'll never forget. And what we've done to the landscape really broke my heart. That was an important time for me to see that land from the ground and to think about the Dust Bowl, which I think was the Dust Bowl created a climate that made it possible. This is one of the things I write about in my book for the GMO to come to that part of the countit was it was very moving to drive across the middle of this country where a lot of this grain is grown, and to think about the history of this country. And, all of it was fun. It was all fun. I mean, I write about everything, from the people I met, everywhere I went, and the places, the things I saw, and I try to make it as rich a book as I can with literary references and music. I write a lot about music. I love music. And there's always music in my writing, and food, and perceptions. I just try to put it all in there. So I had a great time. It was a real adventure.
When you sat down to write the book, did you organize your writing by trips too?
Yes. So the book is literally organized. It's a triptych. It's 3 sections. And the first one is the trip across the Great Plains, and the second one is the trip to Europe, and the third one is the Oaxaca, California story. And that just made the most sense to organize it by journey, and to see sort of 1 year in my life, or 6 months in my life, or 8 months in my life of journeys, and then coming back and digesting the information. I like the number 3. I've always liked it. I don't have 3 children, however, that would be too much. But I do like the number 3. I like how it feels as a reader. I like, as a reader, I don't know if 2 would be too few and 4 would be too many, kind of. So 3 felt right to me. 3 trips and 3 sections.
In the first section, Fly Over Country, about the Great Plains, you connect the Dust Bowl to the advent of the GMO. You were just speaking about the Dust Bowl. This was eye-opening for us. We'd never thought of that. Can you talk about how you landed on that connection?
Oh, well, I think I was watching the Dust Bowl, the Ken Burns, and then I started reading about the Dust Bowl, and I realized, oh my God, this is why these chemical companies were able to come in the late 70s and the early 80s, and say, all your problems will be solved. Because a lot of these farmers, it was their parents or their grandparents who often were still alive and maybe still farming too. And the Dust Bowl wasn't that long ago, and their lives had been, tragically taken off course in the best case scenario. If not, some people's lives were ruined, obviously, and some people died, and some people lost their farms forever. So coming to that part of the country, so this is post-tapping of the Ogallala aquifer, which is also, running dry. But basically, which the idea for that was that you'll never have a drought again. So coming to that part of the country and saying, well, we can take care of everything. We can give you drought-resistant seeds. We can give you seeds that will resist every pest. We can make it so the topsoil will never blow away again. You won't have to till. All you do is spray all these magic potions. These people were very vulnerable to this, and this was still part of their family history. So the connection to the Dust Bowl is very important, and not one that I've ever known anyone else to make. But it was like a lightning bolt that hit me when I was doing all the research, and then when I started interviewing people in the Midwest, and I realized how close it was for them.
I mean, that's quite remarkable that no one else is really speaking about that, because when you say it, it just seems to make so much sense.
It makes so much sense. I don't know why nobody else. I feel like I should have written a whole book about that, in a way. I mean, that's a topic that I wish more people would ask me about, and I wish, I'd like to spend more time on, because I think it's really important. I do think we tend to forget the vulnerability of people in these stories, and what tragedies they're bringing, personal tragedies, and their humanity to making these decisions. I mean, the farmers who have chosen to grow GMOs are not bad people, and we can't forget that. We can't forget what they have brought of their history to this moment, and why they were so vulnerable to the companies.
It's interesting because although the acronym GMO is in the subtitle of your book, it really becomes a book about the environment. In the section on the Great Plains, you spend a lot of time with a young, handsome GMO farmer named Zach Honeycutt. He tells you all the pesticides he uses on his crops. This was particularly eye-opening. We realized at that point that the revelation of the book is that the GMO is one thing, but that the pesticides are a much larger issue. And you mentioned this in one of your answers earlier. One, however, that is intrinsically tied to the GMOs, of course, are the pesticides. We realized at the point that the revelation of the book is that the GMO is one thing, but that the pesticides are a much larger issue, one, however, that is intrinsically tied to the GMOs. Can you talk a bit about how this began to become one of the stronger threads of the book?
Yeah, I went into this trying to understand what a GMO was, and then I realized that the GMOs are tied to the pesticides. The same companies that are modifying 90% of our seeds are also making the pesticides that go with them. You can't have one without the other. The GMO is a seed which is genetically modified to withstand the widespread and constant use of a pesticide, Roundup. It's an herbicide that will kill everything around it but that one thing. So the plant that you're cultivating. So these things are tied to each other. I became less interested in the seed itself and much more interested in all the pesticides that are used on these crops. I became very concerned about what we're using on the soil and on our crops and how that's getting into our air, our water. And I mean, some of these pesticides will stay in the soil for 38 years or longer and continue to be taken up by the roots of plants. And so, it's not good.
Glyphosate, registered as Roundup by Monsanto, has been recently found to be a carcinogen, and there are lawsuits pending on the subject. Yet it's used on crops and patios worldwide. What do you know about glyphosate?
Well, I mean, there are pending lawsuits right now against Monsanto because the glyphosate has been found to be a carcinogen and to cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma for sure. We shouldn't be using it. No one should be using it. And it's been banned in some places in Europe. So the writing's on the wall, except for we live in a country where industry always wins out. So it's going to take a lot of effort to get it off the shelves.
In the book, you discuss a research recession, and also that a lot of the research on chemicals and GMOs are funded by the biotech companies that make them, which you were really just alluding to. Can we discuss this?
So there just isn't enough funding for research. So that's a problem. And the way that a lot of scientists get funding is through the company's industry. So there's an inherent conflict of interest. And many scientists have to sign, agreements that they won't publish, or they won't publish anything negative they find, or things like that. So when this becomes interesting is when a scientist decides to buck that. Like one of the scientists in my book, Tyrone Hayes, he found that atrazine, which is an herbicide, was causing gender abnormalities in frogs. And when he decided to publish anyway, he was breaking a contract, and then he was in a very long lawsuit with the company, with Syngenta. So yeah, it's a problem. Biotech companies are, industry is supporting most of the research in all of our universities. There's almost no independent research anymore. So what does that mean? I think we all have to answer that question and think about it. And then I don't know what one does about it, but it's important to look at all angles of an issue before deciding that a company is telling us the truth.
You also write that Americans are sicker than ever. How tied is this, in your mind, to our food?
Oh, I think food is, essential to how our general wellness and anything from obesity to heart disease to diabetes to the autoimmune epidemic to allergies. It's all tied to our food and our environment, and it's very serious.
What are some of the surprising ways GMOs sneak into our lives?
GMOs are used for plastic, for biofuel, as additives. There are lots of substances which are certainly not organic that are allowed in organic processed foods, like organic pre-made foods, chemicals and additives, preservatives, things like that. They're often made from GMO corn or soy, natural flavors, anti-caking agents, salts, all those things are often made from GMOs. So the bigger question again is not so much the GMO, but the pesticidal load that they all carry. So that way pesticides make their way into everything we're eating.
We know you grew up in a very politically active and artistic Maine family. Did you become an activist while you were writing this book?
I don't really consider myself an activist. I consider myself a writer. I've written about all kinds of different things. I published a piece last year in the Times about, a sexual harassment situation I had, and I've just been writing about Maine's new governor, Janet Mills. I mean, I don't consider myself an activist. I do have a politically active family, but I'm a writer first, and I'm interested in human stories and stories that are interesting to me. And of course, if I can elucidate some sort of truth that's been covered up, that's terrific.
You wrote in your memoir, Made for You and Me, that your parents were part of the Back to the Land movement. How did your childhood affect your writing of Modified?
Oh, that's an interesting thing to ask. I think because there's so much of me that as a child, we had a very pure existence. My parents grew a lot of what we ate. We had big gardens. We lived in the woods. And it was shocking to me to learn what we're doing to the planet with the food we're growing and how much more simple it could be. It's too bad that we've gotten so far from just growing food to sustain, not to make money.
Bees and honey are a huge part of the book, the entire middle section. Many people are concerned about the bees. Can you talk a bit about how growing GMOs affects the bees?
It's simple. It's just the pesticides. The pesticides are, the bees are coming in contact with, whether because they're on the plants or because the plants have actually sucked them into every fiber of their being, and they're in the flowers and in the nectar and in what's called the guttation drops, which is this little sort of dewy drops that the plants emit, that the bees drink for water. All of that we found pesticides in all of those.
The last section of the book is partially about corn contamination in Oaxaca and the scientists who discovered that U.S.-grown corn was contaminating the 10,000-year-old land races of Oaxaca. Is it possible to get pure, non-GMO corn anywhere?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know. Because of cross-breeding and pollination and birds and bees and animals, is it possible to get anything pure anymore is really the essential question of the book. I try to tease that apart in the book, but that's a great question. I don't know.
Your hero and guiding voice throughout the book is Rachel Carson, specifically her book, Silent Spring. We know you've said that you developed a strong bond with that work and with her spirit as you wrote. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, rereading Silent Spring as an adult and then rereading it while I was working on the book was really important to me. What was shocking was that she published the book in 1962, and she was already talking about some of the issues that some of the problems that have still not been fixed, some of the same pesticides we're using and the dangers of them. She was, the question is, what happened? How do we let this happen? This book was a bestseller. She was honored by President Kennedy. After she died, 2 years later, the various programs were DDT was banned, the Clean Water Act. I mean, it seemed like we were on the right track, and yet we're still using the same pesticides that she wrote about in 1962, other than DDT.
Since Trump was elected, what's going to happen to the environment? How do you think a Trump presidency will affect how our agriculture is changing the environment?
Now we're 2 years into Trump, so that's a question that should be dusted off here. But we see what Trump's doing to the environment. I mean, he's interested only in business, and what are the horrors that we could enumerate since Trump was elected? Like, it's just the situation we've gotten nowhere. How about that? We've gotten nowhere with so many things because Trump was elected, and we're spending so much time listening to his vitriol and listening to, having the government shut down so we can build a wall, and having him, appoint somebody as dangerous as Scott Pruitt to the EPA. We've having all these standards rolled back. I mean, we have backslid, and it's terrifying. So we aren't even talking about our agriculture or even dealing with any of the problems. I think it's gotten worse.
Modified made some of the best of lists in 2016. Publishers Weekly and Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop among them. Then a Maine Literary Award for 2017. And you've been speaking about the book around the country at the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco and at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. What's that been like for you?
I'm happy to go where people want to hear this information. I like to meet people and to read the book and to talk about it and talk about writing it. I wish that I could engage more people around this subject, about what we're doing to the environment with the way we're growing food. But it's a start.
You spend most Saturdays at the farmer's market gathering local foods to cook for your family. How has this changed for your family life and your kids' relationship to food?
We know all of our farmers. They're celebrities in our house. Our kids know where things come from. They ask for specific things. They like to go pick out our potatoes or carrots or mustard greens. I think that really changes a person to know where their food comes from. I had that as a child because my parents were growing it. In our case, we grow some things, but my kids know the rock stars who are growing these awesome things that we're trying.
How do you think others can start to shop more locally, and how important is organic? Can one eat locally and organically everywhere around the country? What are our farmers doing all around the country that perhaps they haven't been over the last several years?
I mean, we've seen an incredible explosion of farmers markets, young people farming, especially in Maine where I come from, young people coming back to the state or moving to the state to farm. Farming is very important, and the people who are taking it on and trying to do it without pesticides and doing it in new, innovative ways should be supportive. So yeah, going to farmers markets, buying organic, asking tough questions. We all can do this. We just have to summon the energy and the strength and the time to, cook some carrots rather than go buy a cheeseburger. And it's a mindset change, but once you make that change, it's actually relatively easy. I tell people, just always have in your fridge a bean, like a dry bean that you've soaked and cooked, a grain, and some vegetables, and you can make pretty much anything. You can buy tortillas and make tacos. You can make, just beans and rice or beans and the grain. You can make, if you buy noodles, you can use some of those things as the base of a lasagna. Your options open extensively. So,
has anyone ever told you that your book has changed how they buy food too?
Absolutely. People have told me that the book has changed them, and they've changed so many things in their lives, and there's nothing more gratifying.
We know you cook from scratch a lot, but during the holidays, we imagine the bar gets even higher, and you must be cooking nonstop. What did you make this past holiday season that you were especially excited about?
Yeah, I do cook a lot. I make a lot of things from scratch, almost everything, especially during the holidays. My son just wrote a really beautiful essay at school, my 10-year-old, about this toffee that I make that has chocolate on top, and we have it every Christmas Eve. And I was especially excited I went to a writing celebration at his school to hear his essay about how the toffee makes Christmas Eve night for him. And all of my recipes are ones that I've made up, that I've tinkered with over the years, sometimes written down. My family likes to groan at me because they'll be like, "This is amazing, how did you do it?" And I have no idea. I didn't write it down. It happens all the time. So over the years, I've been writing down the toffee recipe, and he actually helped me write down some of it so that he could put the recipe in his piece that he wrote with no help from me. I didn't even know what I was going to hear at this celebration. It was such a beautiful honoring of food and family and of our traditions, and my efforts to make beautiful, I try to make really beautiful food and food that's really healthy and delicious. So that was really exciting for me. You know, I came up with we don't eat gluten or corn, and we eat all organic. I came up with like a buttery garlic roll this year that I sort of tinkered with a Bon Appetit recipe and to get it right. The Bon Appetit recipe was for gluten, and those were terrific, and I was really excited about those. And those were so great that the same son asked to have them at for his birthday breakfast this January. So I made them the night before and had them. And you know, I like giving that stuff to my family. They're very private. They're special. They, you know, I don't have a cookbook or anything like that out yet. So it's like, you know, these are part of our traditions, and they feel like they're just ours. That's nice. People have been telling me to do a cookbook for years. I've written about food in all of my books, and maybe.
Is there a good GMO? And likewise, is there a good pesticide?
Well, for the pesticide, here's what I would say. One of the scientists in my book said, if it's designed to kill something, nobody can tell you it's safe. So that's a good rule of thumb. No pesticides are ever going to be a good idea. A good GMO, that's a little more complicated. Yeah, there may be some like in China, they're trying to develop a wheat that will need less fungicides. Is that going to be a good thing? Maybe. Is the mosquito that's going to be bred to combat Zika, the Zika virus, it's a GMO mosquito, right? Is that going to be a good thing? It might be, you know. So we can't just across the board say something like a GMO is bad. We can probably say across the boards pesticides are bad, chemicals are bad. But some of these other solutions that we may need, if we say that, you know, we have to have an open mind. We can't just say it's all bad, because then we get nowhere, right? We're not going to get rid of all of those things. So.